Hello one and all. Welcome to Astrolofax. I'm your host, Paul Jackson. Let me begin by saying that I have been determined and admittedly obsessed about answering a specific two-pronged question. This two-pronged question is simple. How does astrology work? And how does it not so much work? In part 1 of this video, I will describe how despite its incongruences, ancient astrology can actually help explain the movements of the sky relative to Earth. But in part 2, I will explain how modern astrology, quite frankly, does not help us understand these movements and has one unavoidable flaw. Stay tuned. Part 1. How does astrology explain the movements of the sky relative to Earth? During the days of ancient Babylon, early scholars established the framework for evenly dividing the widest part of the sky, known as the ecliptic, into 10 subsections, and what would later be known as the 12 signs of the Egyptian and Greek zodiac. Had it not been for these ancient inquisitors, notably the Greek mathematician Ptolemy, who helped identify the constellations under the glow of a crystal-clear sky, there would be no framework provided to later astronomers like Galileo and Copernicus, who provided huge contributions to the identification and positioning of celestial objects. It is through the combined efforts of astrology and astronomy that we can begin to understand the workings of the sky above and below. For some of you, the movements of the night sky relative to Earth are a mystery. That is, until now. For those of you who live in the northern hemisphere, observe. These constellations rotate clockwise in the southern sky relative to Earth. And for my friends who live south of the equator, observe. The same constellations move counterclockwise in the northern sky relative to Earth. Why do I keep saying relative to Earth? Because we are essentially measuring the Earth's movements in relation to the stars. And since the stars are light years away, it is exceedingly difficult to determine their location. In other words, when somebody says the sun is rising, it isn't actually rising. The Earth is turning. However, the sun is rising relative to Earth. Do these constellations look familiar? Why, yes. They are the signs of the zodiac. If you track the movements of these specific constellations, you'll notice symmetrical patterns corresponding to 4 different times of the year. The vernal equinox, or spring equinox if you prefer layman's terms, the summer solstice, the autumnal equinox, and the winter solstice. You might be asking what this has to do with astrology. Well, has anybody asked you what your sign is? They were basically asking you what constellation you are. A sign is a synonym for a constellation. You see, if you kept track of the time of year in which each sign rules, you would discover that Aries is a sign of the spring equinox, Cancer is the sign of the summer solstice, Libra is the sign of the autumnal equinox, and Capricorn is the sign of the winter solstice. But what do I mean by a sign? Well, it's really quite simple. You're probably hip to the fact that the Earth is propelling around the Sun's intense gravitational field as we speak. But you might not consider that the Earth transits through 12 constellations at varying times of the year, 2 of which are equinoxes and the other 2 solstices. On the morning of the spring equinox, the sun rises directly in the east in Aries and reaches its maximum height in the afternoon at 54 degrees above the horizon. It then sets directly in the west. As far as the night of the equinox goes, let's say there was a full moon rising. In this case, the night sky would rise with a full moon in Aries' opposite sign, Libra, and morning would then return again with the sun in Aries. On the morning of the summer solstice, the sun rises directly in the northeast in the sign of Cancer and sets in the northwest, reaching a maximum height of 77 degrees in the afternoon. This is the highest point of the sun's angulature and the longest day of the year. As far as the night goes, let's assume once again there is a full moon rising. The moon would rise in Cancer's opposite sign, Capricorn, reaching an annual low maximum height of 30 degrees above the southern horizon, as it were in the northern hemisphere. As the night ends, Cancer would then return in union with the sun above the northeastern horizon, starting the morning relative to Earth. On the morning of the autumnal equinox, the sun rises in Libra and sets directly in the west. The sun reaches its highest point of 54 degrees at noon, once again rising directly in the east and setting directly in the west. It is only during the spring and fall equinoxes that the sun rises directly in the east and sets directly in the west. In other words, the sun only rises in the east and sets in the west on 2 days of the year. The difference between these 2 times of year, other than the fact that one is fall and one is spring, is that a full moon would rise in Aries on the fall equinox, but the full moon would rise in Libra during the spring equinox. Finally, on the day of the winter solstice, the sun rises in the southeast in the sign of Capricorn and only reaches about 30 degrees above the horizon, making it the shortest day of the year, as it sets in the southwest. If there were a hypothetical full moon, it would rise in Capricorn's opposite sign, Cancer, and reach a record annual maximum height of 77 degrees. As the long night would end, Capricorn would then emerge above the southeastern horizon in union with the sun to begin the second shortest day of the year. But for all my astrologer friends out there, you might be asking yourself, why do the zodiac constellations look so weird in your video? Why don't they look like the zodiac wheel you often see on a canvas? Why are some of them so wide, others so narrow? Well, I'm thrilled to answer your question. And the answer is, because these constellations that I have rendered much more closely resemble the precise measurements, you fool. And I will attempt to prove it, but only if you like or subscribe. Hello viewers, Before I attempt to answer these questions, and continue with part 2, here is my disclaimer. I am mostly an artist, not a certified scientist. But hopefully, through the intricacies of my art and music you now see and hear, you'll better understand how an artist is sometimes an ambiguous scientist. Part 2. How astrology does not work. Astrology can be a very positive medium for self-discovery and social interaction, and can serve as a strong igniter of creative expression and humanity. But it does indeed miss some key details. Nearly every practicing astrologer on YouTube measures the movements of the Earth using what is known as the whole sign house system, whereby the cusp lines of the signs of the zodiac are evenly divided by 30 degrees. However, according to data collected by the Apollo 11 mission and modern-day satellites, the measurements of these constellations vary by much wider degrees. This doesn't mean you should throw away your astrology books. Like I said, astrology is a great tool for understanding the patterned movements of our planet in a more creative and insightful way, which brings a much more humanistic element into the equation of the night sky. But please hear me out. By using this map from the Apollo 11 mission created in 1969, we can determine how many degrees of a circle each constellation encompasses based on the width of their time zones. There are 24 divided segments on this map, representing an entire day on Earth. Each unit represents 30 degrees of Earth's circumference, arranged from 10 to 240. Using these provided measurements, we can now scale a 240 unit map into a 360-degree circle by converting each 10-unit section to 15 degrees, because 15 degrees multiplied by 24 Apollo 11 units is 360 degrees. I've taken the liberty of measuring each constellation and also the gaps between their literal widths. Let's start with Aries. Aries is 15 degrees wide, and there is a 12-degree gap between Aries and Taurus. Taurus is 35 degrees wide, and there is no gap between Taurus and Gemini. Gemini is 28 degrees wide, and there is a 5-degree gap between Gemini and Cancer. Cancer is 12 degrees wide with a 5-degree gap between itself and Leo. Leo is 35 degrees wide with no gap between itself and Virgo. Virgo is the widest constellation at 45 degrees wide, and there is no gap between Virgo and Libra. Libra is 12 degrees wide with a 5-degree gap between itself and Scorpio. But here is where I will give astrology credit. As you can see with Scorpio, it is 29 degrees wide. But the rumored 13th sign, Ophiuchus, does not fit between Scorpio and Sagittarius, but instead, it fits above Scorpio, and it is too far above all the rest to snap to the grid of the ecliptic. If it were included, the Earth's wobble would be much more substantially evident. Let's continue with the remainder of the circle. Sagittarius is 15 degrees wide with no gap between Capricorn. Capricorn is 10 degrees wide, but it overlaps about 10 degrees where Aquarius ends. Aquarius stretches 35 degrees, and finally Pisces spans 40 degrees. Given Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, where it is impossible to measure the point of an object's location and speed at the same time, these degrees are not 100% accurate, the ones I provided, that is. But their accuracy is much more certain than one you would get with an astrological whole sign chart. Because the whole sign chart that modern-day astrologers use assumes each constellation of the zodiac is 30 degrees wide, I will now compare NASA's data points for 3 differing example rising signs. But first, I will need to explain the astrological concept of a rising sign before I draw my conclusion. Astrologers determine your rising sign by entering your birth time and location. This is so they know the exact constellation that was rising on the east horizon at the very moment you were born. So let's say Maggie was born at 6 o'clock a.m. on the summer solstice. Using the whole sign chart, astrologers would determine that Maggie's rising sign, ascendant, or first house sign, as it's known, is Cancer, because the constellation that was rising on the northeastern horizon at the exact time of her birth, or what is referred to by astrologers as the first house, was the sign of Cancer. They would also determine that Maggie's sun sign is Cancer because in late June, planet Earth was transiting through this very constellation. Now that we know what a rising sign is, let's compare a few examples. What is Steve's rising sign if he was born at 12:52 p.m. on the summer solstice? You would think his rising sign was Cancer, but you would be confusing his rising sign for his sun sign. The sun rose at 6 in the morning in Cancer, but Steve was born more than 6 hours later. So based on data provided by Astrocafe, Steve's rising sign is 28 degrees Virgo. If we turn both NASA's data chart and the whole sign chart 28 degrees clockwise from 0 degrees Virgo, high noon is in 2 degrees Cancer with the whole sign house method. But it is 25 degrees in Gemini with NASA's vectors. However, the rising signs still match despite the difference at high noon. Let's try a second example. Sandra was born at 10 o'clock at night during the autumnal equinox, and her sun sign is Libra. Now let's find her rising sign. According to Astrocafe's natal chart, Sandra's rising sign is 8 degrees Gemini. If we turn both charts once again, the results match up evenly. Both rising signs are in Gemini. Now let's try an example where Libra is the rising sign. If Tomas was born on October 9th, 2023 at 6:30 a.m., his rising sign would be 8 degrees into Libra. Now let's use the same metric for NASA's wheel. As you can see, 8 degrees of Libra is 35 degrees of Virgo with NASA's wheel. We have now found an example where 2 of the wheels have 2 different signs. To review, the degree measurements are off on 2 out of 3 examples. Some might say this is not much of a difference, because these measurements are based on exact birth times. But over time, these minute differences can create exponential multipliers and affect the precision of each established sign. But the question remaining is who is correct, and how does one prove it? This leads me to my conclusion. The singular critical flaw with modern-day astrology is this. The established signs have shifted by more than 30 degrees since the days of Ptolemy 2,000 years ago, and the proof is easy to grasp. Astrologers claim the planet Jupiter is transiting in the constellation of Taurus, but if you look up at the zodiac tonight, you will notice that the Taurus constellation is completely empty of a planet. Exhibit A. This is the constellation of Taurus. Exhibit B. This is the constellation of Aries. For my friends in the Northern Hemisphere, tonight on Halloween at 10 o'clock, you will find a bright object hovering 60 degrees above the eastern horizon, relative to Earth. This is Jupiter, racing across the ecliptic through the constellation of Aries. And if you are an astrologer, you might be annoyed to see that Jupiter is not in the constellation of Taurus, but instead cozied up roughly 30 degrees due west. For my friends in the southern hemisphere, Jupiter 30 degrees east of Taurus. So whether you live above or below the equator, the evidence is clear. The sun signs have shifted. This doesn't mean you should burn your astrology books. It just simply means that what you see is what you get. This also means that March 20th, 2024, the day of the spring equinox, is not located on the Aries-Pisces cusp, but the Pisces-Aquarius cusp. What could have caused this? Groundhog Day? The establishment of daylight savings time in the mid-1960s? Based on my research, my hypothesis is this. The great sign shift is most likely due to the difference in equally spaced vectors used by modern-day astrologers and the vectors provided by satellite maps. The consensus viewpoint by many scientists is that ancient astrologers used a fairly accurate system for measuring the sky, but after 2,000 years, the planets in the solar system have shifted their annual returns. I will wrap this up by saying, the stars tell us a lot more about what is true than our instruments can comprehend. Therefore, if we seek to understand ourselves with astrology, we should let the stars, the sun, and the planets in the observable heavens be our guide. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe, and salud!